Rainy nights have always carried something unsettling. The sound of water against the windows, the shadows shifting outside, the way silence feels heavier when the storm surrounds you. Tonight, you'll hear 3 true stories of what really happens when the rain falls hardest and the night refuses to sleep. These are not just tales, they are memories told by those who lived them. Listen closely, but don't listen alone. And if you make it to the end, let me know in the comments which story will keep you awake tonight. Story 1. Knock on the door at midnight. I was only in 6th grade when it happened, but the memory still follows me like a shadow. That night, my parents had gone on a business trip out of town, leaving me alone in our small house in a quiet, rainy town. It wasn't the first time I had the place to myself, but the storm outside made everything feel heavier. Rain slapped against the windows, and the wind whistled down the empty streets like a warning. Before leaving, my mother had given me a careful list of instructions. Lock every door, pull the curtains tight, keep the porch light on no matter what. I remember nodding quickly, almost impatiently, like every child who thinks rules are just a burden. I told myself I would be fine. I was old enough to prove that I could handle one night without them. The evening passed quietly. I watched some television, ate snacks, and tried to convince myself that I enjoyed the freedom. But as the hours dragged on, the silence grew louder. It was the kind of silence that makes you hear every creak in the floorboards, every hiss of the wind through the trees. By the time the clock struck past midnight, my eyelids were heavy, and the storm outside was still raging like it had no end. Then it happened. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to a sound that was not part of the storm. 3 sharp knocks, slow, deliberate. They came from the front door. At first, I thought I had dreamed it. Maybe the thunder had played a trick on my half-asleep brain. But then it came again, steady and unhurried. 3 knocks, like someone who knew I was listening. My heart raced in my chest. I remembered my mother's words: lock the doors, pull the curtains. Slowly, I crept toward the living room. The porch light was still glowing weakly through the rain. But when I peeked through the gap in the curtains, there was nothing. No shadow on the steps, no figure in the yard. Just the rain, endless and pounding. I wanted to believe it was the wind, maybe a branch hitting the door, but deep down, I knew better. Knocks have rhythm. Knocks wait for you to answer. I forced myself to check the house. Room by room, door by door, window by window. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Locked, secure, safe. The rational part of my mind told me there was no danger. Still, my skin crawled with the feeling that something had brushed too close to my world that night. Lying back down, I couldn't shake the thought. Why would anyone be out there in a storm like this, knocking on the door of a child's house at 1 in the morning? If it was a neighbor, wouldn't they have called? If it was a stranger, why didn't they speak? Why didn't they show themselves? That's the detail that haunted me most. Not the knock itself, but the silence that followed. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were there, and yet they wanted to remain unseen. Even now, years later, I think back to that night and wonder if I was being tested. Tested by chance, or by someone who knew my parents were away. I'll never know, but I do know this. When the rain falls heavy and the wind begins to howl, I still hear it. 3 quiet knocks at the door, asking to be let inside. The knocks did not stop, they changed. What had begun as 3 sharp raps turned into something heavier, stranger. It was no longer the sound of knuckles against wood. It was the sound of dragging. Something being pulled across the front steps, scraping and groaning like stone against stone. Every pull made my stomach knot tighter. I stood frozen near the window, afraid to look, yet unable to resist. The porch light flickered weakly, struggling against the storm. Rain poured down in sheets, blurring everything beyond the glass. And then, just for an instant, I saw it. A figure. Small. Fragile. The outline of a child standing in the downpour, motionless in the glow of the dying light. At first, my heart wanted to believe. Maybe it was a neighbor's kid. Maybe someone lost. But then, reason cut through that fleeting hope. No child should be outside at 1 in the morning, in the middle of a storm that violent. No one should have been there at all. The light sputtered again. My breath caught. A flash of lightning split the sky, bright and merciless. In that blinding second, the figure was gone. Vanished. The steps were empty, the yard deserted. Only the rain remained, hammering down with relentless force. I wanted to convince myself that my eyes had played a cruel trick, that the storm had painted shadows where none existed. But when I finally dared to pull the curtain back wider, the truth silenced me. Across the wooden porch, smeared in chaotic patterns, were footprints, small, muddy, soaked into the wood. They trailed back and forth in front of the door, as if whoever or whatever it was had been pacing, waiting. That was enough. My courage cracked in two. I backed away, heart hammering so hard it hurt. Without thinking, I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and pressed the lock with trembling hands. The walls shook with the thunder, but the sound outside was louder still. That dragging noise, circling, returning, as though it would never end. I buried myself beneath the covers, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness until exhaustion forced my body to shut down. I did not sleep. I endured. Every gust of wind felt like footsteps. Every crack of wood in the house felt like a breath at my door. When the sun finally bled through the curtains, I knew I had survived the longest night of my young life. The storm had passed. The world outside was quiet again, deceptively normal. Slowly, with legs heavy as stone, I walked back to the front door. The porch glistened with rainwater. The muddy footprints were still there, darker now against the pale wood. But the worst was not the footprints. My eyes traveled upward to the door itself, and that is when I saw it. Written across the damp surface in smudged strokes of wet charcoal were two words: "Open up." My breath caught in my throat. The letters dripped with rain, uneven and desperate, as if scrawled by a shaking hand. I touched the wood without meaning to, and the black smear clung to my fingers. Cold. Real. Unmistakable. I stumbled back, fear burning deeper than any nightmare I had ever known. Someone had been there. Someone had stood in the storm, knocking, dragging, waiting. Someone had written those words while I cowered behind a locked door, praying it was only my imagination. To this day, I never found out who or what it was. No neighbor admitted to wandering during the storm. No child had gone missing. There were no reports, no explanations, only silence. But deep inside, I believe the truth is simpler and far more terrifying. It wasn't about breaking in. It wasn't about stealing. It was about the invitation. They didn't want to force their way inside. They wanted me to open the door willingly. And that thought, more than the knocks, more than the footprints, is what still keeps me awake on stormy nights. Because sometimes, danger doesn't break in. It waits. It waits for you to let it through. Story 2. Strangers in the abandoned train station. I was 17 when I decided to visit the old railway station on the edge of town. Most people avoided that place. The tracks had been abandoned for years, swallowed by weeds and rust, and the station itself was nothing more than crumbling brick and broken windows. But for me, it was perfect. I loved photographing old buildings. There was something about the decay, the way time left its fingerprints on every wall, that fascinated me. It was a rainy night when I went. The storm had left the streets empty, and that gave me the excuse I needed. No curious neighbors. No one to question why a teenager was sneaking into a condemned building in the middle of the night. I told myself it was for the atmosphere. Rain makes the best pictures. Water dripping down glass, lightning splitting the sky, shadows stretching across forgotten hallways. I wanted to capture all of it. The first 30 minutes were exactly what I expected. The station was silent, except for the steady drip of water leaking from the roof. My flashlight picked out details the moon could not reach. Graffiti sprayed across brick. Benches cracked in two. Iron beams bending under the weight of time. I snapped photo after photo, losing myself in the rhythm of the shutter. But then something changed. I lifted my camera, aimed it down the corridor, and pressed the button. The flash lit up the darkness, searing the image onto my screen. And there, in the frame, was someone else. A figure in a long coat, standing perfectly still near the far end of the hall. My breath caught. The hallway itself was empty. I lowered the camera, looked again with my own eyes. Nothing. Just shadows and rain sliding down the broken windows. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light. Maybe the flash caught a reflection. Maybe my nerves were playing with me. But the unease had already sunk into my bones. Still, curiosity won over fear. I kept going, snapping more pictures, telling myself I would check them later and laugh at how paranoid I had been. That was when I heard it. A metallic clatter, faint but unmistakable. The sound of chains dragging across the floor. It echoed through the hollow building, bouncing from wall to wall, until it felt like it was circling me. I froze, every muscle tense. I knew the place was supposed to be empty. Kids in town told stories about the station, about how drifters sometimes stayed there, but I had never believed them. At that moment, I did. The sound came again, sharper this time, like metal scraping against stone. I swung my flashlight toward the noise, the beam trembling in my hand. Nothing moved. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, caught in the light. The benches, the doorways, the broken clock on the far wall all still. And yet, the air felt alive, charged, as though someone was holding their breath just out of sight. I tried to reason with myself. Old buildings make noises. Beams shift, pipes rattle, water drips. But deep down, I knew this was different. This wasn't the groan of wood or the sigh of steel. It was deliberate. It had rhythm. Just like the knocks on a door, chains have a way of telling you they're real. I should have left right then. Packed up my camera, walked out into the rain, and never looked back. But when you're young, you think you're untouchable. I told myself I'd check just one more corridor, take one last picture. Maybe I wanted proof. Maybe I wanted to see if the figure was really there. As I raised the camera again, lightning struck outside, filling the station with a sudden blinding light. And in that instant, I thought I saw the code again. Just for a second, but clear enough to make me whisper out loud, "Someone is here." The sound came first. A steady rhythm of footsteps, too distinct to be the storm, too heavy to be imagination. They echoed off the cracked walls, following me down the corridor. My breath caught as I realized I wasn't alone. Someone was walking behind me. I turned, slow at first, then all at once jerking the flashlight beam across the darkness. And that's when I saw him. He stood halfway down the hall, hunched and ragged, his hair long and matted as if it hadn't been washed in weeks. His eyes caught the light, glowing a dull, furious red that sent a chill straight through me. In his hand was a flashlight of his own, but it flickered erratically, buzzing like an insect caught between life and death. Each sputter of light carved shadows across his face, revealing a twisted grimace that looked more like pain than anger. And then he spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, and hostile. "Why are you taking pictures here?" The question was simple, but the tone was not. It wasn't curiosity. It was accusation. He sounded like someone who had caught me trespassing in a place that belonged to him. The station was abandoned, forgotten by the town, but in his words I felt possession. He wasn't just there. He owned the silence, the darkness, the ruin. My first instinct was to answer, to explain myself, but fear gripped my tongue. I could only stare as he took a single step closer, the broken beam of his flashlight trembling across the floor. My camera hung useless around my neck. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet my legs locked in place as if the cracked tiles had swallowed me whole. Then, instinct broke through. I spun, bolted toward the exit, and the storm outside hit me like a wall. Rain stung my face as I sprinted across the platform, the old tracks stretching ahead like veins of rust. My shoes slipped on the wet metal, and before I could catch myself, I fell. The impact knocked the air from my lungs. My palms scraped against the gravel, my jeans tore across the knees. For a second, I lay there, stunned, the storm roaring in my ears. And then the thought hit me he was still behind me. I forced my head up, searching for the flicker of that dying flashlight, searching for his silhouette in the rain. But the station was empty. Where moments earlier there had been footsteps, where a man with red eyes had stood and spoken, there was nothing now. The building loomed silent, its windows black, its shadows still. The rain fell harder, drumming against the tracks, erasing every sound but its own. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding like it wanted to escape my chest. I didn't stop running until the lights of home were in sight. Only when the door shut behind me did I finally let myself breathe. It should have ended there. Just a bad encounter, a story to scare friends with. But when I sat down and powered on my camera, the truth became harder to explain. Most of the photos were ruined, blurred beyond recognition, as if water had seeped into the lens or the storm itself had smeared its fingerprints across every frame. The station was unrecognizable, a blur of light and shadow. Every picture except one. That one was clear, too clear. In the image, I was standing in the corridor, my back turned to the lens, shoulders tense. And behind me, filling the frame with a grim expression and eyes that glowed even without the broken flashlight, was the man. He wasn't at the far end of the hall. He wasn't a shadow caught by chance. He was close, just inches from me, close enough that if he had raised his hand, he could have touched my shoulder. That single picture still sits in a drawer, hidden away where I try not to think about it. People tell me it's just a trick of the camera, that I imagine the rest. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know, beyond all doubt, that for one night in the abandoned station, I wasn't alone. Story 3. The Tent by the Mountain Lake. After my breakup, I needed distance from everything familiar. Friends told me to stay busy, to distract myself, but I chose silence instead. I packed a tent, a lantern, and a single bag of essentials and drove toward the mountains. My plan was simple: set up camp by a quiet lake I had once visited years ago, stay a night or two, and let the wilderness strip away the noise inside my head. The timing, however, could not have been worse. By the time I reached the lake, the sky had darkened, and rain was falling in heavy, relentless sheets, the kind of storm that eats the forest alive. Each drop hit the ground like a drumbeat, and the air carried that metallic scent of wet pine and soil. But I was stubborn. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to prove I didn't need anyone. So I pitched my tent near the water's edge, ignoring how the storm kept pressing harder against me. Night settled quickly. The forest became a wall of black beyond the thin nylon of my tent. The rain never slowed, only changed its rhythm. Sometimes it hammered, sometimes it whispered. I tried reading by lantern light, but the words blurred. My mind wandered, back to the relationship I had left behind, back to the mistakes I couldn't erase. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me towards sleep. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the rain hitting the lake, a constant ripple of drops striking the surface. But after a few minutes, I realized something was different. The rhythm was uneven, not random like raindrops, but deliberate. The sound of water being disturbed by something heavier, something moving. It was the sound of footsteps, as though someone was wading slowly through the shallows. I froze. Every hair on my arms stood on end. The lake was supposed to be empty. The entire valley was supposed to be empty. Who else would be out there at midnight, in a storm like this? I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and unzipped the flap just enough to aim the beam outside. The light cut across the surface of the lake, white against the black water. For a moment, I saw nothing but rain. Then faintly, something surfaced. It was a shape, half submerged, drifting unnaturally just beyond the reach of the shore. At first it looked like debris, maybe a log carried by the current. But the longer I stared, the less it resembled anything natural. The outline was too distinct, too human. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my hand. The shape floated there, motionless, as if waiting for me to notice. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out even the storm. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it slipped beneath the water, vanishing into the depths without a ripple. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, that the rain and exhaustion had conspired to play tricks on me. But even as I pulled the tent shut, even as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I couldn't ignore the unease crawling through my chest. The sound of water moving had been real. The shape had been real. and its disappearance had been too deliberate. For the rest of the night, I lay awake, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, staring at the thin walls of my tent as if they could hold back whatever was outside. Sleep never came, only the storm, the endless water, and the memory of something that should not have been there, waiting just beyond the shore. The sound came again, sharper this time. Not the distant ripple of something in the water, but closer, heavier. It was the sound of footsteps pressing against wet ground. Each step landed with a squelch, as if someone was walking barefoot through mud, dragging the water with them. My chest tightened. Whoever or whatever had been in the lake was no longer in the lake. It was moving toward my tent. I held my breath, every muscle rigid. The footsteps grew louder, uneven, but deliberate. They stopped just outside the thin layer of nylon that separated me from the storm. For a moment, the only sound was the rain pelting the fabric above my head. Then came another sound, softer but sharper, like fabric brushing against fabric. A presence waiting. With trembling fingers, I reached for the zipper. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought if I looked, if I forced myself to see, it would be easier to explain. Slowly, carefully, I pulled the zipper down an inch at a time, until there was just enough space to peer outside. And that's when I saw her. A woman stood in the rain only a few feet from the tent. She wore a thin, white nightgown that clung to her skin, soaked through, heavy with water. Her hair hung long and dark, plastered across her face, strands dripping into the mud. But what froze me in place wasn't the hair, or the dress, or even the storm around her. It was what she held. In her arms, cradled against her chest, was a doll, a child's doll. Its fabric body sagged, drenched, its porcelain face cracked with water dripping down its cheeks. She clutched it tightly, protectively, as if it were a living child she refused to let go of. For one terrible second, my mind fought to rationalize. Maybe she was lost, maybe she needed help, maybe she had wandered from some hidden cabin nearby. But as soon as my flashlight beam cut across her face, every illusion shattered. Her features shifted beneath the light, twisting unnaturally like melting wax. Her skin stretched, hollowed, until her eyes appeared two empty sockets, black and endless. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. Only the rain filled the silence. I stumbled backward inside the tent, fumbling for the zipper, dragging it up as fast as I could. The sound of footsteps came again, closer, circling the thin shelter like a predator testing its prey. I knew the nylon walls were useless. If she wanted to, she could step through at any moment. That was enough. Panic broke through hesitation. I grabbed my keys, burst from the tent, and ran toward my truck. Mud splashed against my legs, rain blinded me, but adrenaline carried me forward. I threw myself into the driver's seat, twisted the ignition, and prayed the engine would catch. For a split second, the silence of the storm swallowed everything, and then the truck roared to life. Headlights cut across the lake as I sped down the dirt path, leaving the tent, the supplies, everything behind. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The rearview mirror showed nothing but black forest and rain. No figure, no doll, no trace of her. But I never slowed down. The next morning, I returned with the authorities. I expected disbelief, maybe even laughter, but instead they grew quiet. One of the older officers pulled me aside and told me something I'll never forget. Years ago, a woman had drowned in that very lake. She had gone under during a storm, clutching her infant child in her arms. Their bodies were never recovered. Since then, locals had whispered about strange sightings, about campers who left in the middle of the night, refusing to return. I had thought they were just stories, the kind told to keep kids from wandering too far. But now I knew better. That lakeside has been abandoned ever since. No one dares to camp there. No one dares to fish or swim or even linger too long by its shore. And as for me, I carry the memory of that night like a scar. I can still see her standing there in the rain, clutching what she loved most, staring with eyes that were no longer human. And sometimes, when the storm clouds gather and the rain begins to fall, I swear I can still hear those footsteps dragging, pacing just outside the tent.